Peace can only happen with the consideration of women's voices and needs. I think they bring hope to me with their resilience. Most of it stays with me on an everyday basis, which is why sometimes, as we say, secondary trauma, it is a real thing. My name is Timea Szarkova, and I am the country Peacebuilding manager for Concordis International in Chad and in Cameroon currently.
So, Timea, what first drew you to peacebuilding back in the day?
Yes, back in the day. In fact, I used to work in humanitarian aid, and I started my career with MSF. So working with MSF, I was deployed in quite a lot of conflict zones. And, it was always very meaningful work, and I loved it. It's one of the very great organizations to work for. But at some point, I started to ask questions. Is it enough to help people, to save lives in these situations, or is there something that more we can do? And especially the case of Libya at the time really marked me, because I only worked on Libya during the revolution from outside and slightly inside of Libya, but not very closely. And one of the projects we had in Misrata was to treat prisoners, basically war prisoners, who were being tortured. And we used to treat them with medical aid. And then once they were reestablished, we put them back into the system, because obviously we're not there to free them. But what happened is, such a short time afterwards, they were out again with new injuries because they were tortured again. And eventually they closed down the mission, that part of the mission, the project in Misrata prison. And they said, we're not here to be used, as some kind of a game, that we help recover people from their torture wounds, and then now they're back with the same issues, with the same injuries. So that really got me thinking in the long run. What is it that we're trying to do? If the atrocities continue happening, then us saving lives perhaps is not enough. And I was always quite curious about human nature in general. And so basically then I started working with HD Center for Humanitarian Dialogue. And with them, we were already working on mediation, trying to bring together, protagonists. And it was on Libya, and it was actually very, very interesting. And even though I still had a very background role, in a sense, I was mostly supporting mediation events and organizing different dialogue sessions. And I was already starting to be a lot more curious about, how is it that we can actually build peace? And it's afterwards that I basically resigned, and I ended up going to study my master's in violence, conflict and development in SOAS University in London. Because by then I said, okay, I need to understand what is the framework within which we are trying to build peace. I wanted to understand this whole level playing field, who is there, who's doing what, and how it actually works out. So that's how I became interested. Basically, I wanted to not just save lives in these precarious situations, but also help the cause that makes people suffer.
So what continues to keep you peace building? What continues to inspire your commitment?
I am really curious about human nature, and that's actually one of the really positive sides of my master's degree, because it was a very, very interdisciplinary master. And of course, that in light of my experience up until that point, which was in many, many conflict zones, then afterwards, being deployed directly to Central African Republic, it really helped me to kind of look at everything with a curious eye, and especially looking at human nature. What is it that makes people behave a certain way? And I think that curiosity continues to carry me on. We obviously always are born and come with our own perception, and we look at things through the lenses that we were born with or raised with, in our own culture. But I think when you're working in peace building, you have to try extra hard. It's almost like an anthropological work. You have to try extra hard to leave those lenses behind and look at things in a completely non-biased way. And that's something very difficult to do. But I think once you manage to do that, everything becomes interesting, because you don't really try to add labels to people's behaviors or their cultural belongings or religious affiliation. Rather, you just look at it like, okay, well, let me see what happened here, and what, if, and again, trying to keep that open-minded approach to all protagonists, because you will always have a different story from different sides of the conflict. And I think it's such an interesting, so besides human curiosity, I think it's also a sort of like a capacity that we need to build in our own self, to continuously remain neutral in a way that, that the curiosity goes both ways, to both sides, and at the same time, not letting yourself carried away too much, because I'm also a very empathetic person. And I think that's can be also a good thing, but it can also be a dangerous thing when you work in such a field. You can very easily start to sympathize or, empathize with people about their struggle. So you need to really kind of practice a lot of self-control and the self-awareness while we're doing this work. So I think that really shaped me also, the way that the type of human that I feel like I became, throughout this work. And I'm, of course, continuously evolving and developing into a type of person.
So peacebuilding obviously is full of challenges and setbacks. So when that happens to you, what motivates you to keep going?
I think I can say partially I'm a sort of like an undying optimist, which I don't know if it comes by default, by my date of birth, by my, zodiac sign, whatever that it is. I really believe that there is always a solution. And I find that especially this type of work is just so needed. It's there's days when it's really hard. There's days when you see larger political influences that can hinder the progress that we've made on the ground. Obviously, they have a lot more influence in some of the dynamics on the ground than we can have, and it's it can be very frustrating. But I think my optimism and my belief in the fact that humans actually are good. I feel like it's impossible to do if we don't believe in an inherent good nature of humans, a positive, that people are born with goodness in them, and that, we're not born bad. We're, it's the environment, it's the circumstances that perhaps make people behave in a certain way, or bitter experiences earlier in life. It can be anything, but I believe that we just need to be able to look for that goodness in people and keep on going.
Do you find personal meaning in what you do?
Yes, I definitely do. I think if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to continue. I think partially it's we can say my outgoing human nature. Even by default, I'm very extrovert. I like to meet people. I like to understand people. I like to listen very well. And I think it translates well into my work. So in some ways, it allows me to understand better human nature, and at the same time, really have this diversity, like I mentioned in the first question, when you remove the lenses through which you look at various cultures and ethnic groups and countries, so I feel like a socially rich person. I'm not sure if that even exists, but having such a huge diversity of people that we know, that we work with, and we are able to connect with, is just extremely fulfilling. And I think I like to, the way that I connect to others, I feel like somehow those of us who have this capacity to create these linkages, I feel like it's somehow part of our mission to connect others, even those who perhaps may have been connected before, but that connection been lost. And, one way or other, trying to bring people together.
Is there a story or an encounter with one of those individuals that you've met through this work that's profoundly affected you, and in a sense has reaffirmed why you do what you do? Is there any group or individual that's really quite profoundly affected you with their story?
Whenever I hear stories of torture, and I speak to people who have who come back and show me their wounds where they have been attacked, or just suffered some kind of a gunshot or whatever, machete wound. And it always kind of brings out such a strong sense of injustice in me. Ever since I was young, I always had a very, very strong reaction to injustice. And I think in general, throughout my work, very often when I hear such an unjust action, use of violence against somebody, where easily it could have been solved without violence, it just makes me feel, it just doesn't leave me alone.
So if you had to describe the heart of your work in just one feeling or one idea, one motivating factor, what would it be, and why would it be that?
It might sound a bit cheesy what I'm going to say, but I would say it's unity. And I say that because I am, inherently also a spiritual person. And I feel like when people fall out, they lose that connection, they lose that unity. Eventually, we are all one, we're all humankind, we're all living beings, even if I consider animals, because I'm a huge animal lover. And if we consider the separation from one another, it's when we become very focused, selfish. We don't care about anybody else. We only want our own agenda to be, moving forward. And that's what I feel fuels war, in the global scene as well. We can see nations behaving that way, and we can see individuals as well, or certain groups. And I feel like, us trying to recreate trust between communities where it has been lost. We're trying to unify. We're trying to bring people back to this unity where they actually feel, first of all, they feel the value of the other, or at least the advantage of having the other person around, the other group around. And maybe down the line further, they can also reconnect to the idea of unity, that yes, we are all one. It doesn't matter the color of the skin, or it doesn't matter the belief system or the livelihoods, type of livelihoods, but it's really the matter that we all initially depend on each other.
Fantastic. When you meet women and girls who've survived violence or displacement, what are some of the first things they say to you when they start to talk about their experiences?
Well, I think it's their stories. It's easier for them to speak to another woman. So clearly, if we are able to create that trust across the cultural lines, which is not always a given, but when it is possible, they are a lot more likely to tell us about their difficulties, of how hard their everyday life is. Most of it stays with me on an everyday basis, which is why sometimes, as we say, secondary trauma, it is a real thing. When we listen to people's suffering, it can really impact us, and my compassion to women who have to go through this is definitely impacting the way that I function. I also consider very much the privilege that I have, being born in a context, in a nation, in a country, or living in a nation where I actually do have my safety and security. And what is it that they have to do to actually reach that? And how in our work, even though we're working perhaps on certain conflict, very linked to natural resource management or natural resource use, how that can still impact their everyday lives. Sort of it wakes up my feminist self, in some ways or others. I think about, women's security, women's place in society, and how in so many contexts we have not learned to value what women have to contribute, to social cohesion. What do they contribute to a simple household or even a societal dynamics, and how much better, life actually works out within communities when women do have a voice and do have safety.
Can you talk about the place of hope in these interactions that you're having with women through your work? That where do you see hope? How do you hold hope within yourself for them? Where do they bring hope to you?
I think they bring hope to me with their resilience. Having to listen to their stories and still seeing them carry on and living life, and being able to provide for their children is incredibly inspiring. It makes our struggle almost minimal or nothing. So I think that gives us hope. And I think for them, perhaps the work that we do and the ears that we're able to lend to them it really makes them feel seen and heard. In societies where these kind of things are perhaps shunned upon or forbidden to talk about, it really erases a lot of that suffering that women do have to go through. It really confirms them, that what they felt is real and it actually counts. It matters. It is something that of an importance. Us engaging with those who carry out the violence so that we can offer them alternatives, that already offers hope.
Yeah, absolutely. Just zoning in on the locality now, that hearing quite a lot about Sudanese refugees describing being harmed in Sudan and then fleeing across the border and also experiencing violence in Chad as well, sometimes even by those who are meant to protect them. How do peacebuilders like you begin to rebuild trust for people like that so that they can begin to change the way they think about the situation and perhaps move into a place where they can begin their healing, their freedom from it?
Yeah, that is quite a complex work, if I may put it that way. Firstly, because of power dynamics. When we think about those who are supposed to provide protection actually harming, women or refugees in general, it is a lot harder to attack those causes. In these cases, what we try to do is bring accountability. So basically, when we hear stories of such kind, we try to raise awareness along the hierarchy, understand deeper to what degree how large the problem is. Try to find ways to, it's almost like doing lobbying centrally. If we have good connections to the central government, we should be able to raise awareness about that. My hope is that in this type of situations, if we are able to hold accountable, even if only few members of the particular unit that commits such violations, it can already send out message to all the other ones who perhaps want to behave in a disrespectful or abusive way towards refugees. And I think secondly, it's really important to work with actual army and police and gendarme members to try and understand their motivation. It needs to be a multi-layered response, and we don't always have the opportunity to do so if we are not around, if we're not working in those environments, or if we don't have access.
Peace often feels like a distant dream, especially for women caught up in the conflicts which are being generated by the men in their communities. They're facing the daily insecurities that conflict creates. But what do you see as the sort of starting small step that a community can take to start to build towards a longer term peace process? Where do you think it starts? What's the kernel?
Well, it depends. It depends on what really happened. It depends on what context we find these communities in. There's different approaches that we would have to consider in these situations. But what the most important is to rebuild trust. And trust does not grow on trees. It does not come, overnight. It just because somebody decides to forgive, for example, another person from the other community, with whom they had conflict, it doesn't mean that they immediately start trusting them. Starting to really put at first brakes to violence. We start to stabilize the situation in a way that people are ready to at least put the guns away, or put the violence away, even if it's temporarily, just to watch the space. And then from then on, if that goes successfully, then try to go to each community to understand what is it that they had felt, or where do they feel the injustice comes from? What are the needs, perhaps grievances that have not been taken into account up until that point, and doing that, with all communities, if it's perhaps multiple communities involved, and really going at the speed at which the communities are ready, because there's nothing that you can rush about a peace process. And so there's that element of being extremely observant, while still staying active and watching the signs and watching the opportunities for the next step. Perhaps now there's a little bit of opening where we could do this so-called shuttle diplomacy that I just described, or whether we have to wait with it, or whether there's another big event that we have to wait and see how it plays out before we bring about, the next steps, and so on and so forth. And the more communities are able to keep their promises, let's put it like that, the small promises that they have made along the way, the further they go along the ladder of trust. And of course, once we get to the point where they are ready to be united, where they're ready to be sitting face to face with somebody who can facilitate or mediate between them, that means that's really the space where things can finally play out.
So what are advisory groups, and how are women particularly effective? How do they come into those roles in the first place, and how are they particularly effective?
So Concordis works with the methodology of putting in place advisory groups, and advisory group members are members of the community that have the trust of their community. So they are members of the community that are not identified particularly by Concordis or Concordis' staff, but they are people who communities feel they have trust towards to, and feel like these members can represent their interest and their community within a larger workshop or mediation. So they already are somewhat of a person of trust, or a person of resource, as we call them initially. It doesn't always mean that they are initially peace builders as such. They can simply just be a very, very strong community member who, let's say, represents X community. And by working with them, firstly, we teach them alternative dispute resolution methods. We teach them mediation, dialogue. We teach them, we build capacity around conflict analysis, and around basically how is it that they can act as peace builders within their community to prevent use of violence within a conflictual situation, or actually resolve conflict once it did happen. Now, there are members who are very, very active, because the way we try to work with them is also not necessary to introduce monetary rewards or salary. We really want this structure to be sustainable beyond our intervention. Therefore, from the beginning, we do not offer any kind of indemnity or salary or payment, as I mentioned. We explain them that it's their communities who have chosen them. It means that the responsibility comes with their status within their community. And it means that if they're working for peace, they're not working for Concordis, they're working for their own future and the future of their children. And that often is very telling, and very much puts back the responsibility on these people, and they take it seriously. They are incredibly motivated and dedicated people. People have a tendency to point fingers towards the trusted person in their community being man. All right, that's all good, but we also would like you to tell us who are the women, who could be these women who actually can play an important role in your society. One of the examples that was given, which is incredibly positive, there was a conflict that happened, and a herder's son was kidnapped. When the whole negotiation started, the male member of the advisory group wanted to go, and they themselves realized, so if I go, that means I will be considered as potentially a threat. Because they have women in the same area, women advisory groups, the lady actually accepted to go, and she said, no, it's better if I go. let me see what I can do. And she was extremely brave. She approached the group. She negotiated for the liberation of the hostages. And in many other situations, women spoke out, in the room. They themselves often say, so look, you may not see us, but we are working in the background. When our husband comes home, they speak to us, their wives. Might not seem so. We do have a big impact on how we advise them. And very often they gave us examples where they convinced the men, of not using violence, as a solution to the problem. Peace can only happen with the consideration of women's voices and needs. Women are extremely important to be considered. And that's just somehow, in some situations, the background role. In some situations, it's very forefront, of being and practically a peace builder who goes out and resolves conflict. But knowing, considering women's voices, even if they're not at the forefront, and understanding what is it that they live and how we can contribute to that is just, obviously peace can only work with that. Peace can only happen with the consideration of women's voices and needs.
That's brilliant, Timea.